Hey there, history enthusiasts! Before we dive into one of the most incredible tank battles you've probably never heard about, I need you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive and helps us bring you more incredible tales from history. Seriously, where are you watching from right now? Let me know in the comments below. Now, let's get into the story. September 19th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the rolling hills of Lorraine, France, but you can't see it. A thick blanket of fog smothers everything: trees, fields, roads, and tanks. Somewhere in that gray soup, 262 German Panzers and assault guns are grinding forward, their commanders confident, almost arrogant. They're equipped with the legendary Panther, a tank that outguns, outranges, and outarmors anything the Americans have. The German crews have been told it's going to be easy. The Americans are stretched thin, their supply lines overextended. One good push and Patton's entire Third Army spearhead could collapse. But hidden in that same fog, in concealed positions carefully chosen over the previous days, American Sherman tanks wait. Their 75mm guns are jokes compared to the Panther's 75mm L/70. Their armor is lighter. Their crews know they're outmatched tank for tank. Yet within 72 hours, over 200 German tanks will be burning hulks. American losses? Under 50 tanks. How did this happen? How did the Ronsenleiters, the Shermans that allegedly brew up every time, hand the Wehrmacht one of its most devastating armored defeats on the Western Front? Stay with me, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about tank warfare. The autumn of 1944 was a season of supreme confidence for the Western Allies. After breaking out from the Normandy hedgerows in Operation Cobra, American armored divisions had raced across France at breathtaking speed. Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army was the tip of the spear, driving toward the German frontier with a fury that seemed unstoppable. By mid-September, elements of the Third Army's 12th Corps, spearheaded by the legendary 4th Armored Division under Major General John "Tiger" Jack Wood, had reached the ancient region of Lorraine in northeastern France. The landscape here was different from the Norman bocage, rolling agricultural hills punctuated by small forests and farming villages, with visibility that could stretch for miles on a clear day. The 4th Armored had crossed the Moselle River and established positions around the town of Arracourt, a small settlement that would soon have its name written in the annals of armored warfare. The 4th Armored Division wasn't just any unit. Activated in April 1941, it had entered combat in July 1944 and quickly earned a reputation for aggressive, fast-moving operations. Known as Roosevelt's Butchers and Patton's Best, the division had encountered relatively light German resistance during its dash across France. Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce C. Clark, one of the Army's most capable armor officers, held the exposed salient around Arracourt with about 163 tanks and supporting infantry. Clark's men had enjoyed remarkable success, but they'd faced few German tanks during their advance. That was about to change dramatically. Unknown to the Americans probing forward, Adolf Hitler himself had ordered a counteroffensive. The Third Army's rapid advance threatened Germany's industrial heartland, and the Führer demanded that it be stopped. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Otto von Manchufel, one of Germany's most skilled armor tacticians, was tasked with recapturing the town of Lunéville and eliminating the 12th Corps bridgehead at Doullens-Lourdes on the Moselle River. To accomplish this, the Germans assembled a formidable force, the newly created 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, along with the veteran but depleted 11th Panzer Division. These formations deployed 182 tanks, including 107 of the feared Panther tanks, supported by 80 self-propelled assault guns. A total of 262 armored fighting vehicles, many fresh from the factory. The stage was set for the largest tank-versus-tank battle fought by the U.S. Army to that point in the war. The morning fog that would greet September 19th would shroud more than just the landscape. It would obscure a tactical masterclass in defensive armored warfare. The Sherman tank in September 1944 had a complicated reputation. More than 50,000 had been produced since 1942, making it the backbone of Allied armored forces worldwide. With a crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and bow gunner, the M4 Sherman was never designed to duel with German heavy tanks. Its primary role was infantry support, and in that mission it excelled. The 4th Armored Division Shermans were primarily M4 and M4A1 models with 75mm guns. These weapons could penetrate a Panzer IV's frontal armor at combat ranges and were perfectly adequate against the medium German tanks encountered in North Africa and early Normandy fighting. But the Sherman's 75mm gun faced a grim mathematical reality when confronting a Panther. The German tank's sloped frontal armor was essentially immune to frontal penetration at normal combat ranges. The Sherman could kill a Panther, but only with flank or rear shots, and getting into position for those shots meant surviving long enough to maneuver. The German Panther tank, by contrast, was arguably the finest medium tank of World War II. Its 75mm L/70 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. With sloped armor that maximized protection and excellent mobility for its 45-ton weight, the Panther embodied German engineering excellence. On paper, a single Panther platoon should have been able to destroy an entire Sherman company. But there was a critical problem with the German force assembling for the Arracourt offensive. These weren't the battle-hardened Panzer crews of 1940 or 1941. The 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades were brand-new formations, created in the summer of 1944 as part of Hitler's desperate attempt to regenerate armored forces after the catastrophic losses in Normandy and the Eastern Front. Their crews had received only 2 weeks of training before being rushed to the front. Many couldn't read maps properly. They had no experience in large-scale combined arms operations. Their Panthers, fresh from the factory, still had mechanical teething problems that required careful breaking in. The 4th Armored Division, meanwhile, had been training together since 1941. Though they'd only been in combat since July, their training had been thorough and realistic. More importantly, they'd been conducting continuous reconnaissance of the Arracourt area. Colonel Clark personally scouted the terrain, identifying excellent defensive positions with good fields of fire and concealment. His staff officers analyzed every approach route the Germans might use. They positioned artillery observers on key terrain features and established telephone lines to forward observation posts. The Americans also had another advantage that would prove decisive: air superiority. The 19 Tactical Air Command, equipped with P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, was poised to provide close air support once weather permitted. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was a shadow of its former self, grounded by fuel shortages and outnumbered by Allied aircraft wherever it appeared. By September 18th, all pieces were in position. The Germans had local superiority in both numbers and tank quality. The Americans had superior training, reconnaissance, defensive positions, and air support. Weather would be the wild card. And the weather was about to get very interesting indeed. German propaganda about the Panther tank had created an aura of invincibility. Since its combat debut at Kursk in July 1943, the Panther had dominated battlefields wherever it appeared. Its combination of firepower, armor, and mobility made it feared by Allied tankers everywhere. German crews often exhibited overconfidence bordering on arrogance when facing Shermans, which they mockingly called Tommy Cookers, or knew by the nickname Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company's slogan, "Lights every time." This attitude infected the 5th Panzer Army's planning for Arracourt. Intelligence assessments suggested the Americans were overstretched and vulnerable. The German High Command believed that one sharp blow would send Patton's forces reeling backward. After all, hadn't the Wehrmacht just conducted a fighting withdrawal across France that had bloodied American and British armored divisions at every turn? The new Panzer brigades, equipped with the best tanks Germany could produce, should have been more than adequate to crush a single American combat command. But the reality on the ground was starkly different from German expectations. The Panther, for all its technical excellence, was a maintenance nightmare. Its Maybach HL-230P30 engine was powerful but temperamental. Its interleaved road wheel system, which gave excellent weight distribution and ride quality, became hopelessly clogged with mud or froze solid in winter. The tank's final drive system was notoriously prone to failure, especially when operated by inexperienced crews who didn't understand proper gear shifting. Many of the Panthers designated for Arracourt broke down before ever reaching the battlefield. The crew quality problem was even more severe. A typical experienced Panzer crew required at least 6 months of training to master their vehicle. The young men crewing the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades had received 2 weeks, barely enough time to learn basic operations, let alone the complex tactical maneuvers necessary for combined arms warfare. Navigation was rudimentary. Communication was poor. The brigade commanders themselves were still learning how to coordinate multiple tank companies in fluid combat situations. On the American side, psychological preparation was more pragmatic. Sherman crews under Clark's command knew their tanks were outmatched in direct duels. But they'd also been trained extensively in the art of maneuver warfare. American tanker training emphasized speed, flexibility, and combined arms coordination. Commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Creighton W. Abrams, who would later become Army Chief of Staff and have the M1 tank named after him, had drilled their crews relentlessly on flank attacks, fire and movement tactics, and rapid position changes. The Americans also had no illusions about German capabilities. They respected the Panther's firepower and sought to negate it through superior tactics and terrain usage. American doctrine emphasized that while the Panther might win in a straight-up duel, armored combat wasn't about dueling. It was about getting to the enemy's flanks and vulnerable spots before he could bring his main gun to bear. The fog that rolled in on the morning of September 19th would prove to be a great equalizer. The Panther's superior range meant nothing at 75 yards. The Sherman's faster turret traverse and stabilized gun suddenly became decisive advantages in close-range combat. And the American superior knowledge of terrain would allow them to appear, strike, and vanish like ghosts in the gray morning mist. The myth of Panther invincibility was about to collide with the reality of American tactical competence. The Lorraine countryside around Arracourt in September 1944 presented a tactical chessboard of extraordinary complexity. Unlike the claustrophobic bocage hedgerows of Normandy, where visibility rarely exceeded 100 yards, Lorraine featured rolling hills with elevations rising 50 to 100 feet above the surrounding farmland. These hills provided excellent observation points and natural defensive positions. Between the hills, small forests and patches of woodland offered concealment for maneuvering forces. The villages themselves were typical of northeastern France, clusters of stone buildings with thick walls that could provide cover against tank fire, connected by narrow country roads barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. Many farms featured stone barns and walled courtyards that could hide an entire tank platoon from direct observation. The fields were agricultural land, mostly harvested by mid-September, providing relatively open terrain for maneuver but also exposing vehicles to observation from the surrounding high ground. Colonel Clark had spent days studying this terrain with his staff. They identified key terrain features. Hill 318 dominated the approaches from the east. The town of Bézange-la-Petite sat astride a critical road junction. The village of Rechicourt controlled another major axis of advance. Clark positioned his forces to cover these natural avenues of approach while maintaining flexibility to shift forces as the situation developed. The road network was primitive by modern standards, mostly unpaved secondary roads that turned to mud in wet weather. This limited mobility and channeled movement along predictable routes, which favored the defender. Clark's engineers had time to prepare positions, dig tank scrapes that provided hull-down firing positions, and even prepare demolitions on key bridges, though these weren't ultimately needed. But the most significant terrain feature wasn't visible on any map: the weather. September in Lorraine typically brings morning fog, especially in the low-lying areas between hills. The fog forms overnight as temperatures drop and moisture from the fields condenses in the cool air. By mid-September 1944, this pattern was well established. Each morning, thick fog would blanket the battlefield until late morning or early afternoon, when warming temperatures would burn it off. The Americans had observed this pattern and planned accordingly. Forward observation posts were positioned on the hills above the fog layer, where they could maintain communication with artillery batteries via telephone line. Tank platoons were positioned in concealed locations where they could remain hidden even after the fog lifted, yet could quickly move to intercept German forces advancing blindly through the murk. The Germans, by contrast, had conducted minimal reconnaissance. Their intelligence maps showed the terrain but not the actual positions of American forces. More critically, the new Panzer Brigade commanders didn't appreciate how fog would neutralize their tanks' superior range. They planned their offensive assuming clear weather would allow them to engage American tanks at distance, using the Panther's superior gun to maximum advantage. When the morning of September 19th dawned, the fog was especially thick. Visibility in the low-lying areas dropped to less than 50 yards in places, point-blank range for tank combat. The hills emerged from the fog as islands in a gray sea, their crests visible while their slopes remained shrouded. This created a bizarre combat environment where observation posts on the heights could see German forces moving through the fog below, but the Germans couldn't see either the observation posts or the American tanks waiting in ambush positions along their route of advance. The stage was perfectly set for tactical surprise. At 8 o'clock hours on September 19th, the German offensive rolled forward. The first penetrations came from company-sized elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade, advancing toward Combat Command A's thinly held outpost line from the east and south. The German tanks moved slowly, cautiously probing forward through the thick fog. Their commanders were visible in open hatches, straining to see more than 50 yards ahead. Infantry followed the tanks, huddled against the cold morning air. American forward observers, positioned on high ground that poked above the fog layer, immediately spotted the German movement. Telephone lines crackled to life as reports flowed back to Clark's headquarters in Arracourt. The colonel moved with characteristic decisiveness, ordering his reserve platoons to specific blocking positions while directing artillery to prepare fire missions on likely German approach routes. The first contact came near Bazagne-la-Petite, where 1st Lieutenant Merwin Marston's 3rd Platoon from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, had concealed their Shermans overnight. Marston had divided his 5-tank platoon into 2 sections as per doctrine. His forward observation team, 2 soldiers manning a telephone in a hidden position beside the road, spotted Panthers emerging from the fog at less than 75 yards distance. The Americans held their fire. Discipline was critical. Revealing their positions too early would sacrifice the element of surprise. The Panthers continued forward, their commanders focused on the road ahead, unaware they were being tracked by 5.75mm guns. When the lead Panther reached the kill zone Marston had pre-designated, he gave the order, "All tanks, fire on my command. 3, 2, 1, fire." 5 Sherman guns roared almost simultaneously. The lead Panther staggered as 2 rounds struck its side armor, thin enough for the Sherman's 75mm to penetrate. Fire erupted from the Panther's engine compartment. The crew began bailing out before the ammunition cooked off. The 2 following Panthers immediately reversed their engines, backing desperately into the fog as American shells chased them. Farther north, Captain Kenneth Lameson's C Company tanks engaged more Panthers along the Metz-Strasbourg road. The initial contact destroyed 3 German tanks that emerged from the fog with no warning. The Germans, shocked by the ambush, pulled back south of the highway. But Lameson anticipated their move. He'd already dispatched a Sherman platoon to a commanding ridge position near Bazagne-la-Petite, exactly where the retreating Germans were heading. The pattern was repeated across Combat Command A's front. Small Sherman platoons, carefully positioned in concealed locations with overlapping fields of fire, struck German formations that were advancing blindly through the fog. The Germans' superior range meant nothing. Their heavier armor mattered little when American guns were hitting them in the flanks and rear. The Panthers' thermal sights, superior to anything the Americans possessed, couldn't penetrate the fog. For the German crews, the experience was nightmarish. One moment they were advancing cautiously through gray murk. The next, their tank was shuddering under impact, flames erupting around them, the smell of burning fuel and hot metal filling the crew compartment. Many Panthers were abandoned by their crews without ever having spotted their attackers. The psychological impact was devastating. These young, inexperienced crews had been told their Panthers were invincible, yet they were being destroyed by unseen enemies. By mid-morning, the initial German thrust had stalled with heavy losses. But the battle was only beginning. As the fog began to thin around 11 o'clock hours, the nature of the battle changed. German commanders, regrouping their battered formations, could now see the American positions on the surrounding high ground. For the first time, they realized they'd been attacking uphill into prepared defensive positions, a tactical nightmare. Staff Sergeant James Barry's 2nd Platoon from B Company found themselves in an intense firefight with a reformed Panther Company attempting to flank around Arracourt. Barry's positioned his 5 Shermans in a reverse-sloped defensive position, meaning the hulls were protected by the hill crest while only the turrets were visible to the Germans. This was textbook defensive technique, but it required nerve. The Shermans had to wait until the Panthers closed to medium range before engaging. The Panthers advanced in a staggered formation, their commanders still shaken from the morning's losses but determined to press forward. At 800 yards, Barry's gunner identified the first target, a Panther moving along the tree line. The American doctrine was clear. First shot must be a hit, because a miss would reveal position and draw return fire. "Gunner, tank, 800 yards, traverse right 2 degrees, Burries called from the commander's cupola, his eye pressed to the periscope. "Wait for it. Steady. Fire." The Sherman rocked as the 75 mm gun fired. The tracer arced through the clearing fog and struck the Panther's turret ring, a small vulnerable joint where turret met hull. The German tank slewed to a stop, turret frozen. One down. But now the other Panthers had spotted the muzzle flash. 2 Panthers swiveled their guns toward Burries' position. This was the Sherman's moment to shine. Its faster turret traverse and power-stabilized gun allowed rapid engagement shifts. The Americans fired, shifted, fired again, creating the illusion of more tanks than were actually present. A Panther round screamed past, missing by feet. The German gunner had aimed at where the Sherman was, not where it would be after displacing. American doctrine emphasized fire and movement. Shoot, immediately shift position, shoot again from a new angle. The Panthers, trained in the more static German defensive doctrine, struggled to adapt to this mobile defensive style. "Gun! Gun! Gun!" screamed the loader as he slammed another round home. The gunner acquired a new target, a Panther attempting to maneuver around the flank. The stabilized gun allowed the Sherman to fire accurately even while moving. The shot caught the Panther in the engine deck, and flames erupted instantly. Panthers were mechanically complex. A hit in the wrong place could cause catastrophic failures. Meanwhile, American artillery was having a field day. Forward observers with clear views from the hills called down thunderous fire missions. The 66th and 94th Armored Field Artillery Battalions, equipped with M7 Priest self-propelled 105 mm howitzers, had pre-plotted defensive fire missions covering every likely German avenue of approach. When Panthers massed for an attack, they were hammered by airbursts that shredded exposed crews and damaged external equipment. By mid-afternoon, the combination of ambush tactics, superior maneuver, and devastating artillery fire had transformed the battlefield into a graveyard of burning German armor. The Panthers' technical superiority had been systematically negated by American tactical competence. The German offensive was collapsing, but the fighting was far from over. The psychological dimension of the Battle of Arracourt was as important as the physical destruction of German armor. For the inexperienced crews of the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, the experience shattered any illusions of Panther invincibility. German tank commanders found themselves in an impossible situation. They'd been trained on the premise that the Panther's superior firepower and armor would allow them to dominate any engagement with American tanks. The reality at Arracourt was the exact opposite. Panthers were being destroyed before their crews even saw the enemy. When they did spot American tanks, the Shermans would be gone before the Panthers could react, only to reappear from a new direction moments later. This created a phenomenon military psychologists call battlefield omnipresence. The enemy seemed to be everywhere at once. German after-action reports speak of being surrounded and overwhelmed by American tanks, when in reality they were facing smaller numbers of Shermans that were simply using superior tactics and terrain knowledge. One German officer reported facing at least 30 American tanks in an engagement that post-battle analysis showed involved just 7 Shermans. The fog on the 19th had been psychologically devastating. German crews reported hearing American tanks moving around them in the murk but being unable to see them. The sound of Sherman engines would echo from multiple directions, creating confusion about enemy numbers and positions. When American tanks did fire, the muzzle flashes in the fog appeared like searchlights, temporarily blinding German crews whose eyes had adapted to the gray half-light. For the Americans, the psychological situation was entirely different. Yes, they knew the Panthers outgunned them, but they'd seen Panthers burn. They'd watched supposedly invincible German tanks abandoned by their crews or blown apart by flank shots. This bred confidence. Staff sergeant after staff sergeant reported the same thing. Once you got that first Panther, the second one was easier. Fear transformed into aggressive determination. Colonel Clark skillfully exploited this psychological asymmetry. He rotated units to prevent exhaustion while ensuring that successful platoons shared their experiences with others. When Company C knocked out 5 Panthers in an hour, Clark made sure every other company heard about it. He personally visited forward positions, appearing calm and confident even when German counterattacks threatened to penetrate American lines. The appearance of P-47 Thunderbolts on September 20th, once the weather cleared, compounded the German psychological collapse. The fighter bombers screamed down on German armor caught in open terrain, their 8.50 caliber machine guns raking tanks with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, while 500-pound bombs cratered the landscape. Even when the bombs missed, the sound of the aircraft diving, the whistle of falling ordnance, and the thunder of explosions shredded German morale. German commanders began to report the Americans as having overwhelming superiority in numbers, a perception that bore little relationship to reality. CCA was actually outnumbered throughout the battle, but the Germans' fractured attacks and heavy losses created the impression of American numerical dominance. By September 21st, some German units refused to advance without direct orders from Hitler himself. This psychological defeat was as significant as the physical destruction of German tanks. An army that believes itself beaten is beaten, regardless of the weapons it carries. Arracourt was teaching the Wehrmacht a brutal lesson about the importance of training, leadership, and morale. Lessons that could not be learned quickly enough to change the war's outcome. When the fighting around Arracourt finally subsided on September 29, 1944, the battlefield told a stark story of American tactical victory. German forces had committed 262 armored fighting vehicles, 182 tanks and 80 assault guns, to the offensive. Of these, approximately 200 had been destroyed or abandoned. Many sat as burned-out hulks in the fields around Bazagne-la-Petite, Rechicourt, and Arracourt itself. Others had been abandoned intact by their crews and were later recovered by American forces. The Panthers particularly had suffered catastrophic losses. These supposedly war-winning weapons lay scattered across Lorraine, many with relatively minor damage that caused mechanical failures or crew abandonment rather than catastrophic destruction. American tank recovery crews were amazed to find Panthers abandoned with empty fuel tanks or thrown tracks, problems that a Sherman crew would have fixed in the field but that Green Panther crews couldn't or wouldn't address under combat pressure. The human cost to German forces was equally severe. Approximately 700 German soldiers had been killed in the fighting, with another 300 wounded. Entire tank crews died in their vehicles when ammunition explosions or fuel fires gave them no chance to escape. Others were caught in the open by American artillery or machine gun fire while attempting to abandon burning tanks. The psychological trauma among survivors was profound. Men who'd entered combat confident in their superior equipment left shaken and demoralized, convinced they'd faced overwhelming American numbers. For Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, casualties were remarkably light given the scale of the engagement. Total tank losses amounted to 25 M4 Shermans destroyed and another handful damaged but reparable. 7 M10 tank destroyers were also lost. American casualties in killed, wounded, and missing totaled approximately 200, less than one-third the German losses. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams emerged from the battle with an enhanced reputation as one of the Army's finest armor officers. His aggressive leadership of the 37th Tank Battalion had been instrumental in several key engagements. Within months, he would be leading the relief column that broke through to Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, cementing his place in armor warfare history. Individual Sherman crews became legends within the 4th Armored Division. Sergeant Smith's crew, which had knocked out the 1st Panthers near Bazagne-la-Petite on September 19, received personal commendations from General Wood. Staff Sergeant Barise, whose platoon had destroyed 5 Panthers in a single engagement, was recommended for the Silver Star. The material captured from the Germans was substantial. Intact Panthers were recovered and studied extensively by U.S. Army ordnance officers, who'd had limited opportunities to examine the German tank in detail. These studies would influence American tank development, though ironically the war would end before many lessons could be fully implemented. German commanders attempted to explain away the defeat in their after-action reports. They cited American air superiority, valid, numerical superiority, false, and terrain disadvantages, partially true but exaggerated. Few reports mentioned the superior American tactics, better reconnaissance, or more effective use of combined arms. This failure to learn from defeat meant similar tactical errors would be repeated in subsequent battles, including the Battle of the Bulge 2 months later. For the American forces, Arracourt became a textbook example of how to fight defensive armor operations. The battle would be studied at Fort Knox and armor schools for decades. The Battle of Arracourt, though largely forgotten in popular history, became one of the most studied armored engagements in U.S. Army military education. By 1946, detailed after-action reports and tactical analyses were being used to train the next generation of armor officers. The battle demonstrated several critical lessons that would shape American armored doctrine for decades. First, the importance of reconnaissance and terrain analysis was definitively proven. Colonel Clark's decision to spend days studying the ground and positioning his forces in carefully selected defensive locations paid enormous dividends. The Americans hadn't simply reacted to German attacks. They'd shaped the battlefield to favor their tactics and negate enemy advantages. This emphasis on terrain-centric planning became a cornerstone of U.S. armor doctrine. Second, Arracourt demonstrated that technical inferiority could be overcome through superior tactics, training, and leadership. The Sherman tank never became the equal of the Panther in a direct duel, but American crews learned they didn't need to fight fair, they needed to fight smart. Maneuver, combined arms coordination, and aggressive use of artillery and air support created a whole greater than the sum of its parts. Third, the battle highlighted the critical importance of crew training and unit cohesion. The Green German Panzer brigades, despite superior equipment, simply couldn't match the tactical proficiency of the veteran 4th Armored Division. 2 weeks of training proved utterly inadequate preparation for the complexity of modern armored warfare. This lesson would inform American military training philosophy throughout the Cold War and beyond. The psychological dimension of armored combat also became a subject of intense study. Military analysts noted how American confidence grew through success while German morale collapsed under pressure. The winner effect in armored combat, where initial success breeds more success through enhanced morale and tactical confidence, was clearly demonstrated at Arracourt. For the German military, Arracourt represented another step in the Wehrmacht's decline. The loss of 200 armored vehicles in a single battle couldn't be easily replaced. More importantly, the failure of the counteroffensive meant Third Army retained its positions in Lorraine, positions that would serve as jumping-off points for offensives into Germany itself. Hitler's demand for aggressive counterattacks had squandered precious armored reserves that might have been better used for defensive operations. General Patton himself took note of the battle, though he curiously omitted mention of it in some of his communications. The Third Army commander was focused on his own drive toward Germany and chafed at Eisenhower's orders to halt and consolidate. But even Patton recognized that Arracourt had proven the quality of his armored divisions. The 4th Armored had faced the test and emerged victorious. For the men who fought there, Arracourt became a defining experience. Tank commanders who survived the battle went on to fight through the Battle of the Bulge, across Germany, and into Czechoslovakia. Many stayed in the army after the war, bringing their hard-won lessons to a new generation of armored warriors. When Lieutenant Colonel Abrams became General Abrams and eventually Army Chief of Staff, the lessons of Arracourt, terrain, maneuver, combined arms, remained central to his vision for armored warfare. The battle's greatest legacy may be its demonstration that wars are won not by superior technology alone, but by the soldiers who know how to use what they have to maximum effect. In the misty fields of Lorraine, American tankers proved that courage, skill, and tactical competence could triumph over technical superiority. So there you have it, the Battle of Arracourt, September 1944. A battle where 163 American tanks faced 262 German armored vehicles, where supposedly inferior Shermans destroyed or forced the abandonment of 200 enemy tanks while losing only 25 of their own. This wasn't a miracle. It was the result of superior reconnaissance, better training, tactical brilliance, and soldiers who understood that victory goes not to the one with the best equipment, but to the one who uses their equipment most effectively. The lesson of Arracourt echoes through military history. Know your terrain, train your troops relentlessly, fight as a team, and never mistake technical specifications for tactical reality. Those Sherman crews couldn't change what they drove, but they could change how they fought. And that made all the difference. So here's my question for you. If you were commanding a Sherman platoon in that morning fog, facing Panthers you knew outgunned you, what would you have done? Would you have had the nerve to let them get to 75 yards before firing? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with anyone who loves military history.